Wish TV. All Indiana Politics
is your premier source for Indiana politics.
Focusing on issues that matter to you.
In-depth, nonpartisan coverage, exclusive interviews with Indiana's political leaders, expert analysis on critical legislation. From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
And welcome back to another episode of All Indiana Politics Conversations. And today we're joined by State Representative Ed DeLaney. Representative DeLaney represents a portion of Indianapolis. He has served in the legislature since 2009. Representative, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Garrett. Good to be here.
So, Representative, tell me a little bit about your upbringing.
Well, I grew up in a small city in upstate New York. And as to politics, I got involved young because my mother was a ward worker. She worked at the polls and so forth, and I got a job through politics as a kid at a swimming pool and stuff. But my first real political experience was sweeping out the local headquarters for John Kennedy's election. That's quite a while ago. I wasn't paid, but I was proud, so that's how I really got started.
Tell me more about that.
Well, you know, back then there was a lot more patronage politics and a lot more local politics, so the local party in the city called Elmira in upstate New York, they had a headquarters for the election, and people would pick up literature, have meetings and so forth, and my job was to sweep out the headquarters. And I was very proud to do that because I had met Kennedy once, met his brother later when he ran for the Senate in New York. So I was all into that. You know, that was an era when, for young Catholics, to have somebody run for president was both a great opportunity and a great source of fear. My parents had been very concerned. My mother had gone through the election with Al Smith and Hoover, where there had been a lot of anti-Catholic talk. So we were very excited about that. So that was really when I first did anything that amounted to anything. A few years later, when in college, I ran a congressional campaign for a Democratic candidate who predictably lost. So I got experience with losing, which I guess I needed that.
What was it like getting to meet then Senator John F. Kennedy?
Well, I met him in the most interesting way. I touched him, literally. I got myself dressed up as a press photographer for my school. I wore a hat with a sign in it that said press, and I went to this rally in Rochester, New York. My mother went with me and a friend, and I got up on the stage. You could walk up on the stage with a presidential candidate, an 18-year-old kid wearing a hat. And out of the side of my eye, I saw a vision. I saw a woman running across the stage. It turned out it was my very middle-aged mother, was running across the stage for the purpose of touching John Kennedy's back. She got that done and was in heaven. It was a great lesson to me about politics and about mothers.
It's kind of hard to imagine that today with all the security around.
You couldn't get near that today. Yeah, it was. We know how it ended with Kennedy, so it was. We didn't know it was dangerous.
Yeah, and so you served in the Navy. What led you to join?
Well, again, my mother was a big influence. My dad had been one of those rare people who was too young for World War I, too old for World War II, and all of his friends and neighbors all had served in the war. My mother told me from the time I was 5 years old, you need to serve. There is a draft, but you need to serve. You'll want to be a veteran someday, and you want to do your duty. So when the time came, despite the fact that I was very active in the anti-war movement, I volunteered for the Navy and made an agreement to go to Officers Candidate School, and they committed that they would send me to language school, which was something I was very interested in doing, and they fulfilled their promise.
I want to back up a little bit. You mentioned you were active in the anti-war movement, so obviously this is during the Vietnam era.
Right.
Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, you know, that war went on for a very long time. The warm-up sort of began like in 1960 or 61, and the war ended really in 75. So it was like a 15-year episode. And like a lot of students, I was a college student. I had my doubts about why we were there, what we were hoping to accomplish, and so forth. So I started participating in conversations. We started out on a very friendly basis. We used to have things called teach-ins, where people would argue the issues openly, publicly, not just stand up and be against the war or for the war. We would argue it out, have conversations. And at the end of all that, I decided I was against the war, so I participated in a number of demonstrations. And totally nonviolent. I was against violence, and the few times where I saw signs that something was going to get out of control, I made sure I was no part of that. I thought it was a free speech issue, not a violence issue. So, yeah, that was, in fact, ironically, my wife and I, we kid about our grandkids. They're into a lot of pre-planning for marriages. We got engaged in the dormitory conference room at 9 o'clock, and I had to finish it off to go out and give a speech. So that's sort of how the marriage got started.
Yeah. Now, was this at IU? Or?
No, I went to what is now called Binghamton University. It's now a fairly large state university in New York. It was a new school at the time. It was a new system, and we had a governor, moderate Republican named Rockefeller, who was doing a lot for the university. So it was a great school. It started out great, and it's much better now. I never went to sea. The Navy sent me to Monterey, California to learn Russian. That was a full year, all day, every day. That was your job, your mission. And then I was sent to Washington, D.C., where I was in the headquarters of the Naval Security Group in a very low-level junior officer type job. And I was only there less than a year when President Nixon decided to reduce the size of the officer corps. We had quite a build-up. So you could volunteer to leave, so I did. So I was in about 2.5 years altogether.
Tell me a little bit more about your service. You learned Russian, is that correct?
Yeah, that was my mission, was to go to Monterey, California and study Russian at the Defense Language Institute, which is for all the services. They had like 24, 25 languages. I had some say. I got to pick Russian, and at the time that was the heart of the Cold War, so it was a very critical language. The Navy didn't put it to use really, but I did have a contract with an organization that was really a CIA front, so I translated Soviet military newspapers, which translating wasn't hard. The typing was very hard because I've never been a good typist. So I made money on the side by working for them, and I continued that when I was in law school.
Yeah, I don't know to what extent you can get into this, but anything particularly memorable coming out of those Soviet military newspapers?
No, they were just standard reportage. There was a lot of military history in the Soviet newspapers, and I remember translating articles about World War II and why the Russians, the Soviets did what they did and how they thought that was instructive. So I think the government was trying to follow the logic of Soviet military thinking. I wasn't getting any deep, dark secrets.
Not sure how much they'd put into one of their military newspapers, but still know your enemy, right?
I learned a great deal by reading Soviet newspapers. I learned to read for what wasn't there. It was a fantastic way to learn. Read what they're not covering, and that tells you a lot about what they're thinking.
Yeah, somehow I suspect that's going to come up again in our conversation.
Yeah.
So before we leave your military career behind, I do want to ask, what were some of the big lessons for you that came out of that period of your life?
Well, some of the lessons came from being in officer's candidate school and learning that even though I was a smart aleck, that there were consequences to misbehavior. So I was newlywed. I was anxious to see my wife on the weekends, and when I misbehaved, I didn't get to see my wife on the weekends. I get to march around with a gun all by myself. So I learned a lot about being an adult. I learned a lot about taking orders. I learned a lot about organization. I think I learned a great deal from the Navy. It was a pleasant surprise to me that some of those lessons continue to this day. I learned how to dress better. How's that?
So now let's transition into your legal career. What first got you into law?
Well, I like to say that in my family there were really three choices. I could be a priest, a doctor, or a lawyer. So I had been in the seminary. I'd been in the Jesuit seminary for the better part of a year, which was a great experience, very formative, but I decided I wanted to have a family, so I got out of the seminary. So the second choice was to be a doctor. I was a pre-med. I was doing well at it, but it turned out to me to seem like too much science, not enough art, not enough human contact to suit me. So I dropped out of that, so I was down to the last choice, which was to be a lawyer. And I was fortunate. I had the GI Bill. I had a wife who was willing to work 3 jobs. And I had this language qualification, which I think got me into Harvard Law School. So I did that for 3 years with 2 kids.
Now, so tell me a little more about that.
Well, that was an interesting experience because they had a ghetto at Harvard for married students with children, and Tricia Nixon lived in the same building. She was married, didn't have any kids, so the Secret Service was around my building all the time. And there were a lot of great professors. That was a wonderful component of that. And I got to be very serious about being a lawyer. I loved it. I'd practiced law for, 45 years, and thought it was the best thing I could have ever done.
What were your main practice areas?
Well, I was at Barnes & Thornburg. I was a partner there. I was there 30 years altogether, and I was strictly a trial lawyer. I did 2 wills, and I needed very careful attention from my partners to make sure I did them correctly, okay? I didn't like to write contracts. I dealt with things that had already fallen apart, not with creating things. So I tell people I have a great understanding of contracts, securities. I did a lot of securities law for Merrill Lynch, but I only learned from mistakes. I was only involved in controversies or clear errors or questionable conduct or honest conduct that was misunderstood. So I did products liability for GM and Caterpillar Tractor, tried a lot of cases. I was a libel lawyer for quite a while, tried a lot of libel cases. I tried one libel case for 5.5 months in Phoenix, longest jury trial of my career. I did a lot of class actions later on in my career. So I would get bored, I have to admit that, with one kind of work. Or the economics would change. The libel law work dried up because we won too much. We libel lawyers for the newspapers made the mistake of winning every time, so we disheartened the plaintiffs' lawyers. so I had to move on.
Yeah. You mentioned you primarily got involved, in your words, when things fell apart. What were some things that taught you about society as a whole?
I think I learned the most from juries. It was incredible. And from judges. There were a lot of judges who were harsh, hard on the lawyers, very demanding, and I learned how to deal with that. Some were very partisan, but I learned to deal with that. But I think I learned the most from juries, from the judgments they would make, the analysis they would make. Some of my favorite moments are the times when judges would allow you to meet with the jury after the verdict. Or in one case, I was in a small courthouse I won't identify, where you could stand outside the jury room door and listen to the debate. And as a trial lawyer, that's money in the bank, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, how juries think. So I think I learned a great deal from that. And I learned a great deal from my clients. My clients often were very successful business people who had a lot to defend in terms of assets, and who sometimes had made a misjudgment. Sometimes they really hadn't, but it would appear that they had, or they were a good target. So yeah, and I learned a lot about other lawyers. One of the things I learned was you don't have to be 6 foot tall and articulate to be a trial lawyer. You have to be a bulldog. So I lost cases to some people that you would have said, this guy's got no hope. He can't string 2 sentences together. He dresses sloppily. And he beat me. I learned a lot from getting beat by people that on paper weren't supposed to beat me.
Yeah. This is something that interests me both as a journalist and as a graduate of the University of Missouri. You were the founding lawyer for Investigative Reporters and Editors. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that was a great opportunity. I no sooner arrived in Indiana and at the Barnes Law Firm when the prosecutor arrested 2 or 3 reporters from the Indianapolis Star who were surveilling police who were thought to be buying and selling ill-gotten goods. And they got a Pulitzer Prize for this, but they also got a couple people arrested. So since I was fresh out of law school, knew something about criminal law, knew something about journalism, first free speech, I should say, I got dragged into this case, and I got to meet a lot of young reporters. And this is before the internet, before computers were widely used, but they told me that the biggest struggle they had in preparing their articles was they needed information from out of town. They had no mechanism. They had found friends. They'd call the Chicago Tribune and find somebody who might be willing to talk and so on. So they wanted to have a network for training and education of investigative journalists and to make friends with people who might be able to work with them. So we started that in 1975, I believe it was, and I was the lawyer for 25 years for the group. They had the big libel suit in Arizona. There was a lot of corporate work, and as things changed and as I got deeper into my law practice, after 25 years, I said, that's enough of this, and let somebody else take the pleasure. But it was a great pleasure. I met a lot of great reporters from around the country. Les Whitten is one that comes to mind. I briefly met Jack Anderson when he was in his heyday. There were reporters from Newsday that were particularly brilliant, Boston. So, yeah, it was a great experience for me. It was a high-risk client because they had nothing going for them other than energy, but it worked out to be a very good client.
Yeah. What do you think were some of the biggest cases for you working for IRE during those 25 years?
Well, the biggest one was the one in Arizona. It was a libel case. IRE, by coincidence, was just getting formed when a reporter named Don Bowles was assassinated in Phoenix. And we were having our first convention, which had maybe 100 attendees, 2 weeks after he was attacked. He died 8 or 9 days after he was attacked. And so it was the number one topic at our first convention, and the organization decided to send reporters to Arizona basically to finish his work, not to uncover who committed the murder, but to finish his work. In passing, the articles referred to some of the chief suspects for the murder, and that led to a libel suit that took 5.5 months. The first witness against me was Barry Goldwater.
No kidding.
Yeah, so I got to cross-examine Barry Goldwater. And there were all kinds of senators, ambassadors. It was a big case, 5.5 months, which we won. That was probably my longest trial. By far.
Yeah, what was that like, cross-examining Barry Goldwater?
Well, it was a hoot. This is a very unusual set of facts. So the trial occurs just before the 1980 election. Goldwater's in trouble. He barely won. He's older. And he's being asked to be a character witness for the man who's basically suspected of having financed this assassination. And so the only question for Goldwater really is, from the plaintiff's lawyer is, doesn't my client have a wonderful reputation? And what is this wonderful reputation? So no matter how the lawyer put the question, Goldwater would testify that the plaintiff's mother had the greatest reputation and was one of the finest people in all of Arizona. No matter how the question was put, it was about the son. Goldwater was not going to answer. And Goldwater's kind of fumbling. He was having some issues with his age. And so all I had to do is, I said, I got to ask him something. So I asked him some softball questions because he hadn't hurt me. So I'm not going to go up there and in front of an Arizona jury and insult their senator, the former presidential candidate. So I just gave him some softball questions, and I think I shook his hand. I've never done that with a witness before or since. So it was a moment to remember.
Yeah. I brought up the University of Missouri connection because IRE is headquartered on the campus of the J School. Did you ever get a chance to go to the J School in Columbia?
I was there repeatedly. We started out with a professor at Ohio State who was named Paul Williams, who had written some great stories, who was our first university contact. We needed a university place to have students to do research and work and staff us at low cost. Then we had kind of a competition, and the University of Missouri won. So I went, I was in Columbia, Missouri pretty often for quite a few years. Great town, and that school of journalism was solid, still appears to be solid. So that was a very good decision for IRE to have this base of enthusiastic young people willing to help do a lot of the grunt work for research, organizing conventions, things of that sort.
Yeah, I know I believe they're headquartered in Lee Hills Hall now, and I did have a couple classes there when I was in college.
There you go.
Yeah. So what are some things that you really took away specifically from your IRE career about the First Amendment and the way that interacts with society, particularly now as you sit in public office?
Well, I learned to be a great believer in the free press, and it wasn't simply because I was getting paid for it. It's because I got to know a lot of reporters, and I saw the energy and commitment that many of them had. I saw a few that I thought were not as great as they could be, but generally people were very serious and very capable. I learned the cost of, getting sued. I mean, I can't even imagine. I can't remember what I had to charge to be in with another guy from my law firm in front of a jury for 5.5 months. So I learned the cost of that. I learned the importance of standing up for defending what you printed. I see that game being played out now. The Atlantic magazine is getting sued over what they said about the U.S. Attorney General. So, yeah, I became deeply committed to the First Amendment and deeply satisfied with the current state of the law, which says that if you're talking about a public figure or a public issue, as long as you're not knowingly false or reckless, basically if you made an effort, if you didn't just make up the story, you made an effort and you have some basis, you should be okay. And I came to believe in that. I think there's some people who I consider to be legal extremists who want to undercut that, and I see lawsuits being used as a tactic. Rich people or people with assets, power, sue to, instead of defending themselves or explaining themselves or perhaps even behaving better, they choose this mechanism. So, yeah, I'm very strong on this issue.
This is a theme that I'm going to eventually return to in part 3 as well, but I want to address this now. How would you say the things that you learned both in the Navy and in your legal career impacted your political career?
Well, I think, first of all, they gave me a lot of information about things that I wouldn't otherwise know, okay? I mean, so I know a lot more about industry than I would expect if I was doing auto accident cases or if I was writing wills. I learned a lot about a lot of different industries, which directly or indirectly come before the legislature. So I learned a lot about products liability law, First Amendment issues. So I learned a lot from those clients. I learned quite a bit about the insurance industry when I was doing some of that later on. So I think my career in the legislature has benefited from that knowledge and that background, and I think that's been helpful. So I think that is probably the main takeaway. From the military, I learned how to behave better. I mean, let's be honest about it. It's just that simple. And how to work with people who you don't necessarily agree with. And I learned that in the law business. I mean, I had clients that I philosophically were very disparate. I can remember I used to have lunch with the editors of the Indianapolis Star when it was the biggest paper in the state and was very, very conservative. And I was the liberal Democrat. And I'd go to lunch with some of the leadership because I knew them, and they'd cross-examine me. And I'd tell them what I thought. I guess there was some risk that I'd be fired, but I never was fired. So I learned how to understand business, understand different philosophies, and figure out how to stand up for myself. And that's really what you do as a trial lawyer. You stand up for somebody else, and that's the great lesson. In the legislature, I am speaking for my constituents very specifically on issues that relate directly to them, but I'm also speaking broader for the population of the state. That's my obligation. And sometimes I have to soften my views because I think I'm either ahead of or behind the opinion of my constituents. So that's not always easy, but there are times when I say I've got to rethink what I'm doing and reach out. And, of course, I treat the Republicans like they're my jury. It's probably the worst jury I ever had. I can't convince them of very much. Most juries, I had some success in convincing them.
Well, to that point, I mean, obviously this applies to both floor debate in the legislature, which I've certainly seen plenty of that in my career, and also to the courtroom. Is you might be debating somebody on the opposing side. The question is, disagreeing without being disagreeable, right?
That's a very critical thing. Look, I want the majority to think that I'm credible, to think that I'm decent and I'm not hostile, and to think that I'm putting out some information that's useful. Those are goals that I think I can achieve by controlling myself and my speech. The other thing I'm trying to do is to make sure that when they make the mistake they're about to make, they can't say they weren't told, okay? That's gotten to be my job, to say, you're about to do something that we're going to regret, and why don't you reconsider? They generally don't reconsider, and so we go ahead. We passed a bill this year about, helping ICE and the federal authorities enforce immigration that I think is unwise and that now the Attorney General is trying to use that law to raise Cain around the state. So, but at least they heard that they didn't want to do it, that they shouldn't want to do it. So, yeah, it's a very peculiar function being in the super minority. I'm working to get out of that position, but that's where I am for the moment.
We will leave that there for today. Representative, thank you for coming in today. And in our next episode, we'll get into your role in the Dayton Peace Accords and as an election monitor in Russia. For now, thanks for coming in.
All right, take care.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network. Watch All Indiana Politics live Sunday mornings at 9:30 on Wish TV and at wishtv.com. Subscribe to this podcast and listen weekly here on the All Indiana Podcast Network. And be sure to discover even more great podcasts at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Central Indiana. Wish TV is now live on YouTube TV and Hulu Live, offering more hours of local programming than any other station. Search for Wish TV or look for CW8 on both YouTube TV and Hulu Live to find us. Watch local news, sports, and lifestyle shows live from Wish TV. You can still catch Wish TV free over the air or stream it live on wishtv.com and on the free Wish TV mobile apps. Wish TV, available in more places for the latest news, weather, and sports.
Don't let high golf rates drive you out of bounds. Save big with the Wish TV Great Golf Club Card.
Central Indiana's largest golf club card membership is back for the 8th season with more courses than ever before. Save over 75% on tee times at 27 Central Indiana golf courses. All you need is the Wish TV Great Golf Club Card. Cards are valid for the entire 2026 golf season.
Great courses, great savings. Score your Great Golf Club Card today.